television in the 1980s was a pretty big deal. And the reason for that is many of us did not have cable television until, the late 80s or the 90s, in some cases even after that. So we only had a few channels. And the shows on those channels made a bigger difference than if you have 200 channels and Netflix and Amazon Prime and all of these things. We had, in the mid 80s, we had VCRs, but generally people didn't own them. They had to rent the actual VCR at the store along with the movies. Buying a VHS tape was completely cost prohibitive. A movie in the 80s, for example, if you wanted to buy The Godfather or something, that movie could cost $80 to $100 just for a VHS tape of that movie. Even a lousy movie. So anyway, with that in mind, I thought I would show you some books that are talking about television in the 1980s. And I have TV 82, which was put out to celebrate whatever was on TV in the 80s, and then TV Superstars 1980, then the book of TV lists, and I have the book of movie lists here, but these two are a set, so we're really only going to be talking about this book. So the book of TV lists is pretty cool because it was put out by the same company, or at least it was very much inspired by the famous book of lists that came out in the 70s, which was a huge hit. And then they made the book of TV lists. They made the book of movie lists, and these were actually really good. If you grew up in that time period, this was of a great interest, and it goes over television in that time period. I had a foreword by Lloyd Bridges. I'm sorry, not Lloyd Bridges, Buddy Ebsen. They look alike. Give me a break. Okay. Buddy Ebsen was in the Beverly Hillbillies, and he was already quite old at this point, but we all watched the Beverly Hillbillies. Even though that was an old show in the 80s, it was on reruns, and reruns were a big deal for us kids who grew up in the 80s. That's how we watched Gilligan's Island. That's how we knew about all of these shows that were put out so long before. And this shows the ranking, like the highest rated shows in history. And at this time, Dallas, this is before The Sopranos, obviously. This is before Lost. At that time, Dallas, Roots, the presentation of Gone with the Wind, movies were shown on the weekends. So major movies, for example, when I was growing up, on the weekend, Star Trek 2 or Smokey the Bandit or Jaws or Close Encounters would come on, and that would be huge ratings because in most cases that was the only way you could watch the movie. And then on top of that, like when Superman aired, it wasn't just Superman, but it was Superman with extra scenes added for the television viewing, so it made it even more of an interesting experience. So Lucille Ball was a fixture on television in the 80s on reruns, but she was so well known she would guest star on shows all the time. This was Roots. You might recognize LeVar Burton from Star Trek The Next Generation. Roots was a really big deal when it came out. It came out in the 70s. Mary Tyler Moore, we saw those reruns. Gilligan's Island, of course. Charlie's Angels, it was very popular. This is Chico and the Man. That's Freddie Prinze Sr. He actually committed suicide. His son, Freddie Prinze Jr., I really like him from Star Wars Rebels. He's the voice of Kanan Jarrus. Michael Landon and Bobby Hart. You've probably seen him on The Big Bang Theory. Michael Landon was huge in it. He was on a show called Little House on the Prairie. He was on a show called Bonanza, and he was on a show called Highway to Heaven when I was a kid in the 80s. This book is just lists, and it has some provocative lists, like the first 4 TV shows to feature frontal nudity, things like that. And actually, stuff there was actually. I mean, I know we're getting now where there's a gray area between what can be shown on TV versus cable. But to tell you the truth, um, uh, the violence is definitely worse than what they could have shown back then. But in fact, they can. Back in when I was a kid, they had to be very careful of what kind of violence they could show. And here they're talking about violence. Like, for example, the movie Shogun was the first time on TV you saw a man beheaded. You could see that every weekend on The Walking Dead now. The first time on TV you heard the expression "piss on you." That was, I mean, I'm surprised they could probably say that on SpongeBob now. For the first time on TV, you saw a man literally getting peed on by another man. That was on this movie Shogun, which was a controversial miniseries that came out on NBC. But it was, this is talking about all of the things that were banned or prohibited on television. The last chapter was more in terms of sexual content. This is more in terms of language and violence, nudity, and it, like I Dream of Jeannie, when it was out, you might have seen it in reruns. They had to put a little divot to cover up her belly button. The Untouchables. Later went on to host Unsolved Mysteries, which was a very huge classic show from the 80s that is very defining to my generation. Kathy Lee Crosby's list of 50 Hollywood stars committed to fighting drugs. And some of them, as you might recognize, succumbed or were victims of it themselves. This was a thing in the 70s and 80s called the peer principle. You don't even hear about it anymore, but once upon a time, and they wrote a book called The Peter Principle, which was the idea that you would reach your level potential and then start to decline. Like, you would continually go up and then you would start dropping. And these are actors they said had hit their Peter Principle. And there's some disagreement about a lot of these. At this time, they said Steve Martin had, but obviously he made a huge comeback. Henry Winkler has, to a great extent, made a comeback on the show Barry. Farrah Fawcett went up and down over her life. Robert Blake, he's gone through some legal problems. The most uncooperative TV stars: Frank Sinatra, Carol O'Connell, Red Fox, Eric Estrada. Worst dressed women on TV. How stars exercise and keep in shape: Robin Williams, Linda Carter, Cheryl Teagues, Valerie Harper, Andy Kaufman, Chevy Chase. Yes, the Muppets were huge when I was a very young kid in the late 70s and early 80s. The Muppets were a very big deal. A little trivia note, they actually started on Saturday Night Live, where they were a bit of a flop, and they realized that they needed to adjust the time slot and move them a few hours earlier to prime time. Three's Company was really big with John Ritter. Robin Williams was really big. Clint Eastwood was on that show, Rawhide. Stephen King's list of 8 of the most macabre TV shows ever telecast. So if you get this book, some of these lists might be interesting to you. If you have some time, this book and some YouTube, you could go and find some of these shows and rediscover some possibly forgotten things. That's why I love these old lists, because they do the detective work for you. Buck Rogers, and someone pointed out in my video a couple of days ago, I was incorrect when I said that Linda Gray was in Buck Rogers. It was Erin Gray, and yes, thank you for that correction. I thought the picture didn't look quite right like her, but that's my old brain. The older you get, the more you forget. What can I say? Fantasy Island. This was one of those the whole family would watch shows. Came on after The Love Boat, and it was fun to watch. The commercials. You can find most of these old commercials on YouTube now if you're interested. This show, Real People, I remember when that came out. It was criticized. It was called The Freak Parade because it was basically like a television freak show. It's Ronald Reagan. People were still baffled that he became president after being an actor. Sally Field is the Flying Men. And that's it for that book, and there's an index in the end of it. The next book I want to show you is TV Superstars of 1980. So this will give you an idea of how we started the decade off with the most popular stars on television at that time. 1980, I was in the first grade, so I remember it pretty well. And there's an introduction, and then we start with Penny Marshall, who just passed away not that long ago. She was on Laverne and Shirley and Happy Days. She was hugely popular. Cindy Williams was and when I was a kid, I used to think Penny Marshall was the cute one, and now I think Cindy Williams was the cuter one. You change when you get older. Eric Estrada on Chips. He was insanely popular. Larry Wilcox was his partner, but he definitely eclipsed Larry Wilcox. They just made a movie version of Chips, which didn't do so well in the theater. Polly Holiday, she was Flo in Alice. And she also was in some other movie I saw recently where she played a total bad guy, and her character ended up getting killed. I can't remember what it was, but Kiss My Grits was her trademark line. That was also another popular show. Linda Lavin. She was on a show called Alice about a waitress. George Benedict, he was on the original Battlestar Galactica. Later he was on the A-Team. He played Starbuck. And Richard Hatch, who recently passed away, he played Apollo. Michael Landon, a beloved actor. Melissa Sue Anderson, another quite popular actress on Little House on the Prairie. A lot of guys had a crush on her. Melissa Gilbert, not so much. Everyone thought Melissa Sue Anderson was like the pretty one, and Melissa Gilbert was like the annoying sister. The other little kids in Little House. There's the wife on Little House. Ron Howard, big time movie director now. Henry Winkler, he's now on the show Barry, where he plays Bill Hader's acting teacher. Bonnie Franklin. A lot of these people have passed away when you think about it. I mean, a lot of them have. Valerie Bertinelli, she was, a lot of people had a crush on her. And Mackenzie Phillips was the troubled other actress on that show. She was, I believe she was fired from the show. Patrick Duffy was on Dallas. Jacqueline Smith, one of the Charlie's Angels. The prettiest angel I used to think was Kate Jackson. She later was on a show called Scarecrow Mrs. King. Robert Urich. I liked him in Lonesome Dove. He's a good actor. There's also a show called Spencer for Hire. Donna Pescow, Angie. I absolutely do not remember Donna Pescow. And I don't remember that show. Tony Danza. He was on Taxi. He was on Who's the Boss in the 80s. That was like his big 80s show. Judd Hirsch. Taxi, Independence Day. You've seen him in something, for sure. Donny Osmond. Him and his sister Will Never Go Away. Marie, you see her on diet ads on TV all the time. Joyce DeWitt, she's had some trouble lately. She was Janet from Three's Company, and after the show ended, that pretty much was the end of her career. She produced a really scathing hit piece on Suzanne Summers that was turned into a TV movie that was released right around the time John Ritter died. So she probably felt pretty rotten, because in that show she portrayed John Ritter as kind of a turncoat. That's John Ritter, beloved actor in the 70s and 80s. He was in a show in the 80s called Hooper that was really good, but I don't think people were ready for it. Suzanne Summers, one of the biggest sex symbols of the 70s and 80s. Linda Carter, of course, Wonder Woman, now in Fallout 4. Linda Carter is the Wonder Woman I grew up with, the woman I most associate with Wonder Woman. Nicholas Hammond was the first Spider-Man, Nicholas Hammond. And so he was Peter Parker. He was a bit of an older Peter Parker. Bill Bixby was the Incredible Hulk. That was the Hulk I grew up with, Bill Bixby. And Lou Ferrigno actually was the Hulk. Bill Bixby was David Banner, or Bruce Banner. Robin Williams, very tragic but funny comedian. For the longest time, as a prank, he told people he was born in Edinburgh, Scotland. That shows up in many, many books, but it was not the truth. Pam Dauber. And they did not even put a picture of her in here. They just have this one right here. Gary Coleman, another tragic story from the 70s and 80s. Just very tragic life. Dick Van Patten, Betty Buckley. And then the kids from Eight Is Enough. Willie Ames, he's had some troubles. Lanny O'Grady. There's a bunch on that show. Adam Rich. He went on to do voice acting in the Dungeons and Dragons cartoon show I used to watch. Christy McNichol. Leif Garrett. Another one of those like Tiger Beat heartthrobs. Gary Frank and Ricardo Montalban from Fantasy Island. Hervé Villachez. And finally Jim Henson and Miss Piggy. I cannot stress how popular Miss Piggy was, but she's on everything, as you can see. She was on everything. And the last book I'm going to show you is TV 1982. So this is when I was in the 3rd grade. And what can I tell you about 1982? Well, I remember when 1983 happened, it seemed like we were really in modern times. 1982 was definitely the last gasps of disco. They were finally ending. The clothing started to turn into what we recognize from the mid-80s. The music started to turn into the alternative around between 82 and 83. So you could say that period that sort of started in 1975 was ending by 1982. And let's see what was popular in 82. The Greatest American Hero. I really, really loved that show. I was getting to that point where I was understanding more interesting, good stories on television, and The Greatest American Hero was still kind of a family show, but it was, I really, really liked it. It was basically, if you haven't heard of it, it was about an ordinary high school teacher who gets superpowers. The Dukes of Hazzard, when that show first came out, everyone watched it. I mean, people loved that show. I can't stress how popular it was. She was one of the major reasons it was popular. Catherine Bach as Daisy Duke. And between the two brothers and her, I swear they covered all their bases on getting fans. Different Strokes was also hugely popular. And Gary Coleman, I mean, when I was a little kid, I thought he was, the smartest, coolest thing in the whole world. And all of these poor kids just had very difficult lives. The Facts of Life. Originally, Molly Ringwald was on this show. It went through so many different incarnations. When it first started, it had a huge cast, and then they trimmed it down to just these 4. And then they stopped being in school, and they opened up like a pantry or something. It was really weird. But they tried to stretch that thing on as long as they could. MASH, another show that is just iconic. When that show ended, I think it was this year or the next year. I mean, it was like all over the news. It was like the shuttle launch. It was such big news. They even had MASH action figures, which I had. Happy Days. We had 8-track tapes of music from Happy Days. It was when the first of the 50s nostalgia shows. Because my parents, the 50s was like the 80s to me. To them, the 50s is when they were kids, so watching Happy Days reminded them of their childhood. I used to always ask them questions about the 50s. So, and now I'm realizing that the 80s is as long ago as the 50s was then. So, didn't he look like the guy who plays Riker on Star Trek The Next Generation? Laverne and Shirley, also taking place in the 50s. The Love Boat was, believe it or not, incredibly popular. Every week you wanted to see who the special guests were going to be. It would be like Jamie Farr and Charo and Don Rickles and Chips. General Hospital. I never really watched it. It was one of the soap operas. Little House on the Prairie. Three's Company, The Powers of Peter Barton. I don't remember that. I think it was a quickie. It didn't last very long. Oh, but this book had little like fan addresses too, so you could write and get their autographs. Hill Street Blues. That was, I mean, this is a show my dad would watch, but I didn't watch it because I thought it was boring. And then it has like little snippets about like Gabe Kaplan from Welcome Back, Kotter, or Lee Majors from The Fall Guy, and $6 Million Man, Simon and Simon. So anyway, that's just a little bit of television in the 80s. And I hope you enjoyed hanging out with me for a few minutes and talking about old times. So, and I will see you tomorrow night. I really appreciate you coming by, and if you haven't done so already, I'd appreciate it if you'd subscribe and give me a thumbs up, and maybe a nice comment, because they encourage me. I really do appreciate them. So thank you so much. Bye.